Animation in the 1960s wasn't just bright colors and harmless fantasy. Beneath the surface of what many assumed was children's entertainment, a handful of filmmakers were experimenting with politics, sexuality, war, religion, and social rebellion in ways that deeply unsettled governments and censors. These weren't Saturday morning cartoons. They were confrontational, subversive, and sometimes openly provocative. Some were pulled from theaters. Some were heavily censored. Others were restricted, suppressed, or quietly buried after outrage from officials and moral watchdogs. The 1960s was a decade of cultural upheaval, and animation became an unexpected battlefield. While Hollywood largely kept its animated output safe and family-friendly, filmmakers in Europe, Japan, and beyond were pushing the medium into dangerous territory. These films proved that drawings could be just as threatening as live action. Here are 10 controversial animated films of the 1960s that faced bans, censorship battles, or official suppression. The Fabulous Baron Munchausen, 1962. Directed by Karel Zeman, this visually inventive Czech film blended live action and animation in a fantastical retelling of the Munchausen legend. While celebrated artistically, it faced suppression in certain territories during periods of strict state control in Eastern Europe. Authorities worried its themes of exaggerated heroism and absurd authority figures could be interpreted as satire of political leadership. In some regions, distribution was curtailed following shifting cultural policies that demanded ideologically aligned art. The film's playful distortion of reality was seen by censors as potentially subversive. Although not globally banned, it experienced significant restrictions in markets sensitive to allegorical critique. Its imaginative style masked commentary about power and storytelling itself. The controversy reflected how even fantasy animation could attract suspicion in politically tense climates. Creative reinterpretation of myth became grounds for scrutiny when governments feared hidden criticism beneath spectacle.
Belladonna of Sadness, 1973. Though technically released in the early 1970s, this Japanese production was conceived in the late 1960s counterculture wave and embodies the era's most radical impulses. Directed by Eiichi Yamamoto, the film tells the story of a woman who makes a pact with a demonic entity after suffering horrific abuse. Its watercolor visuals are stunning, but the content is explicit, blending eroticism, violence, and religious symbolism in ways that shocked audiences. Several countries refused distribution due to its graphic sexual imagery and perceived blasphemy. The film was suppressed and effectively disappeared for decades before later restoration. Authorities objected to its depiction of female sexuality as both weapon and liberation. It was considered morally corrosive and unsuitable for public exhibition in conservative markets. Banned screenings and limited releases ensured it became a whispered legend rather than a mainstream success. Its controversy stemmed from erotic violence and religious transgression.
Animal Farm, 1954, reissues in 1960s. Although originally released in the 1950s, animated reissues of this adaptation of George Orwell's political allegory faced renewed bans and restrictions in several countries during the 1960s. As Cold War tensions intensified, governments on both sides of the ideological divide scrutinized its anti-totalitarian themes. In some Eastern Bloc nations, the film was prohibited outright for its critique of authoritarian communism. Meanwhile, certain regions in Latin America restricted screenings, fearing it could inspire dissent against ruling regimes. The blunt depiction of revolution turning into tyranny struck too close to contemporary political realities. Censors argued that its message encouraged distrust of leadership and social institutions. While praised in Western democracies, it became politically radioactive elsewhere. The film's animated format did not soften its impact. Instead, it allowed sharp political commentary to reach broader audiences, which alarmed authorities who preferred such critiques remain unseen by the public. Cleopatra, 1970. Produced at the tail end of the 1960s anime revolution by Osamu Tezuka, Cleopatra blended historical spectacle with explicit adult themes. The film included nudity, sexual humor, and psychedelic sequences that led to outright bans in several conservative countries. Marketed as adult animation, it challenged the global assumption that cartoons were exclusively for children. Some distributors refused to handle it, fearing public backlash.
Religious groups condemned its portrayal of biblical and historical figures in erotic contexts. Even in Japan, it stirred controversy for pushing animated content into overtly sexual territory. International censorship boards cited indecency laws when blocking theatrical release. While not universally banned, it faced heavy cuts and restrictions that limited its distribution. Cleopatra's legacy lies in proving animation could tackle adult material openly, but that boldness triggered moral panic in markets unprepared for animated sensuality and provocative reinterpretations of classical history.
Pinocchio in Outer Space, 1965. This Belgian-American animated feature reimagined the classic character in a science fiction setting. While seemingly harmless, it faced unexpected restrictions in certain countries due to its religious undertones and reinterpretation of a beloved moral tale. Some educational boards criticized its deviation from traditional values associated with the original Pinocchio narrative. In parts of Europe, church groups objected to its blending of space fantasy with moral allegory, arguing it trivialized spiritual lessons. Though rarely fully banned, it encountered localized censorship and limited distribution. Concerns centered on whether the film confused children with its hybrid tone of sci-fi adventure and moral instruction. During a decade when cultural gatekeepers closely monitored youth media, even unconventional children's animation could spark backlash. Its mild controversy reflects the era's heightened sensitivity to reinterpretations of classic stories, particularly when innovation collided with entrenched expectations about appropriate storytelling for young audiences.
Yellow Submarine, 1968. At first glance, this psychedelic musical adventure tied to the Beatles seems harmless. Yet its surreal imagery and countercultural tone triggered censorship in several territories. Some conservative regions objected to its abstract visuals, fearing drug references embedded within the kaleidoscopic animation style. The Blue Meanies, anti-music villains of the film, were interpreted in certain countries as political allegory. In parts of Southeast Asia and the Middle East, the film faced restrictions or temporary bans due to perceived subversive messaging and its association with Western youth rebellion. Officials argued it promoted anti-authoritarian attitudes and psychedelic culture during a period of global unrest. While never universally banned, it encountered censorship cuts and limited exhibition in stricter markets. Its vibrant aesthetic masked a deeper anxiety among authorities who saw 1960s pop culture as destabilizing social order and traditional values during a politically fragile era of youth movements.
1001 Nights, 1969. Another entry in the adult animation wave from Japan's late 1960s experimentation, this film embraced erotic storytelling inspired by Middle Eastern folklore. Produced by Mushi Production, it featured stylized nudity and sensual imagery uncommon in animated cinema of the time. Several countries denied release certificates, citing obscenity laws. Religious authorities objected to its reinterpretation of culturally significant tales through a sexualized lens. Even where not fully banned, it faced severe cuts that altered narrative coherence. The controversy centered on its unapologetic adult orientation and psychedelic tone. Marketed as part of a trilogy aimed at mature audiences, it clashed with international expectations of animation as child-appropriate entertainment. Customs officials in some territories reportedly seized prints upon import. The film's blend of eroticism and myth proved too provocative for conservative regulators. Its limited release ensured it remained obscure outside niche audiences for decades following initial screenings.
The Hand, 1965. This short animated film by Czech artist Jiří Trnka became one of the most politically sensitive animated works of the decade. The story depicts a potter harassed by a giant disembodied hand demanding he create statues in its honor. Widely interpreted as an allegory for totalitarian control over artists, it was banned in Czechoslovakia after the Soviet invasion in 1968. Authorities deemed it politically dangerous and suppressed public screenings. Trnka's death shortly after its release further intensified its symbolic power. The film was reportedly withheld from official circulation for years. Its simple puppet animation concealed a fierce critique of artistic repression. Censors feared audiences would recognize parallels between the controlling hand and authoritarian regimes. Though brief in length, its message was unmistakable. The ban cemented its reputation as a landmark of political animation and a cautionary tale about creative freedom under surveillance states.
The Triplets of Belleville,
Early concept circulated in late 1960s. While the final film emerged decades later, early animated shorts and concepts from European studios in the late 1960s experimented with exaggerated caricature and social satire that occasionally faced exhibition resistance. Several avant-garde festival circuits reported pushback against grotesque character design and implied political mockery. In conservative regions, programming committees declined screenings, arguing the distortion of human figures was inappropriate for family audiences. Though not formally banned nationwide, such works were effectively suppressed through exclusion from public venues. The controversy highlighted a divide between art house animation and mainstream acceptability. Authorities questioned whether animation that abandoned cute aesthetics undermined moral clarity. These suppressed shorts paved the way for later boundary-pushing European animation. The quiet censorship they faced reflected discomfort with experimental storytelling that blurred lines between humor, critique, and surreal social commentary during a decade already marked by cultural instability and generational conflict.
Alice in Wonderland, 1966 animated segments. This British television adaptation incorporated animated sequences that some broadcasters overseas considered unsettling. Its darker tone and surreal imagery diverged sharply from the sanitized Disney interpretation familiar to global audiences. Certain markets restricted or declined broadcast due to fears that its dreamlike distortions and ambiguous morality might disturb children. Educational authorities argued it lacked clear ethical messaging. In more conservative territories, the portrayal of authority figures in absurd or mocking contexts raised concerns. While not universally banned, it encountered regional broadcast prohibitions and editing demands. The 1960s climate of cautious media regulation meant that even classic literary adaptations could be scrutinized if presentations strayed too far from accepted norms. The controversy underscored how expectations around children's programming limited artistic experimentation. Animation that embraced ambiguity rather than clear moral lessons risked being sidelined by regulators prioritizing predictability over imaginative reinterpretation.
The 1960s proved that animation was never just for children. As societies wrestled with political unrest, cultural revolutions, and generational change, animated films became unlikely lightning rods for controversy. Governments feared allegory, religious groups feared blasphemy, moral watchdogs feared sexuality and rebellion slipping into youth culture through colorful imagery. Some films were officially banned. Others were restricted, censored, or quietly suppressed until safer decades arrived. What unites these works is not shock value alone, but their willingness to push the medium beyond safe commercial boundaries. They challenged assumptions about what animation could say and who it was for. In doing so, they exposed the fragility of systems uncomfortable with critique. Today, many are studied as artistic milestones rather than threats, but at the time, they were considered dangerous. And that reaction reveals just how powerful animation became during one of the most turbulent decades of the 20th century.